Good afternoon here in Berlin. Good morning to New York or wherever you're watching us. My name is Caroline Imke, and let me welcome you warmly to the first panel and the opening of our Transatlantic conversations on Neo-Fascism. I'm very, very excited to be able to be here on this theater stage, the Globe Theater of the Schaubühne. I'm very excited that you are here and watching, and evidently I greet everyone on the web who's watching too. Let me first of all hand over to Daniel Mandelson, who actually initiated these conversations, whose idea it was, and with whom I'm cooperating on this transatlantic conversations. I hope Daniel is there. Can we see and hear him?
I'm here.
There you are.
Here I am. Good. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, alles gut. Okay. Thank you, Caroline, and welcome to everybody. I'm happy to introduce this event, and I'm going to introduce it with a poignant remark, which I shared with Caroline the other day when we were talking as we were setting up this event. I was speaking to my 91-year-old mother the other day, who's avidly following world events for many years. And she said, I was born in the 1930s, and it looks like I'm going to die in the 1930s. And it made a great impression on me, and it went to the heart of the event that Caroline and I have been so excited to bring together today. I think we all know that in the past decade, there's been a striking rise throughout the world of cynically demagogic, explicitly anti-democratic right-wing movements in a way that's really unparalleled since the Second World War and the decade that led up to it. Major national elections, as we know, Poland, Hungary, Great Britain, and the United States have placed in power regimes and governments whose agendas flagrantly and systematically challenge and violate norms of the orders that have been in place for many decades. In those and other countries, outspokenly white supremacist and anti-Semitic, anti-democratic parties and candidates have been enjoying unparalleled successes in ways I think that would have been unimaginable even 15 or 20 years ago. I think of even ostensibly minor events and characters such as our own Carolina Congressman Madison Cawthorn, who openly expresses his admiration for Adolf Hitler and on his social media. These remarkable shifts, which we've been witnessing, are marked equally, and I think interestingly, by resistance quite often on the parts of electorates to acknowledge the nature of these very alarming developments. And that resistance is one of the things that we'll be talking about in this first panel today. So with those things in mind, I approached Caroline maybe a year ago about starting a series of conversations about this crisis in global politics, one that would share perspectives from different countries on both sides of the Atlantic. And so that's why we have come together this weekend. As you know, there will be 4 panels, each treating a different aspect, as we see it, of the crisis. The first of these panels is specifically about the issue I just mentioned, which is the resistance on the part of both electorates and I think media as well in a very significant way to acknowledge the nature of the problem that we're seeing. When do we get to call fascism fascism? I'm going to introduce 2 of our speakers today, Timothy Garton Ash and Masha Gessen, and Caroline will introduce our counterparts in Berlin. Timothy Garton Ash is a professor of European Studies in the University of Oxford. the Isaiah Berlin Professorial Fellow at St. Antony's College, Oxford, and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution in Stanford University. He's been a contributor to the New York Review since 1995, and his column on international affairs in The Guardian is widely syndicated in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Masha Gessen is a contributor as well to the New York Review of Books and a staff writer for The New Yorker. They are the author of 11 books, including Surviving Autocracy, very much to the point of our conversation today, and The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, which won the National Book Award here in the United States. They have written about Russia, autocracy, LGBT rights, Putin, and Trump for the New York Review of Books and the New York Times.
Yeah, let me take over to introduce my two guests here in Berlin. Let me start to my left. Stefanie Schuler-Springorum is the director of the Center for the Study of Antisemitism, Zentrum für Antisemitismusforschung of the Technical University in Berlin. She has done extensive research on the history of Jewish life in Germany and is involved in numerous projects to convey and commemorate this history. Michel Vivioka is a sociologist and professor at the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. His research focuses on anti-Semitism and the recent rise of right-wing anti-Republican movement in France. Welcome to both of you. And let me also say thanks once to the New York Review of Books and Daniel Mendelsohn, and to the Schaubühne for making this possible, and thanks to the Bildungsagenda NS Unrecht, die gefördert wird von der Stiftung Erinnerung, Verantwortung, Zukunft und dem Bundesministerium für Finanzen. These are the foundations and the projects that make this whole event and this whole weekend possible. Having said that, let's get right into the beef. I would like to start with sort of a terminological analysis, or an analysis of actually, you know, what are we talking about when we talk about fascism? And maybe let me start with Timothy. There have been different theoretical approaches to understand fascism: structural analysis, psychoanalytical analysis, Marxist analysis. So how would you define fascism? Would you define it as an ideology? Would you define it as a movement? Would you describe it as a political order?
Thank you very much, Caroline. It's a great pleasure to be with you from Oxford, which I'm glad to say is still on the European side of the Atlantic, although Boris Johnson would like it to be the other side. Or certainly I'm on the European side of the Atlantic. I'm so glad you started with that question, because I have to say, I think the title for this session is magnificently circular. If you say, when do we start calling fascism by its name? Well, obviously, when it's fascism. When do we call a spade, when it's a spade? But that begs the question, number one, what is a spade? Number two, is this a spade? I think myself, I want to argue that's the wrong place to start. So let me explain why. Most unproblematically, fascism is clearly a term used about and used by, self-description, a whole bunch of movements and regimes, starting in Europe after the First World War, Italy, Germany, Spain, Romania, elsewhere, and continuing until, let's remind ourselves, in its final days, the early 1970s. Franco died in 1975. But even that group of movements and regimes is ill-defined, right? Umberto Eco, in a wonderful essay in the New York Review, called it a fuzzy totalitarianism, a beehive of contradictions. Now then add on to that, Caroline, all the theoretical debate you're mentioning, which in German alone would fill several libraries. Someone wonderfully said, fascism suffers from an excess of definition. And that's an excess of definition. Then add on to that, the last 10 years, where people like Jason Stanley, the Yale philosopher, or Paul Mason, the campaigner and journalist, have been trying to apply the term fascism to the phenomena that Daniel started talking about. And that adds a further layer of definitional complexity. So my own view is that actually the way to start, I mean, call me a pedestrian Anglo-Saxon empiricist, if you will, but the way to start is not to start by trying to find a definition and then say, does Trump or Putin or Viktor Orban or Kaczynski or AfD measure up to it? But the other way around, I would start by looking at all those movements of our time and then saying, how does the history of fascism help us to think about them, to understand them? Because clearly they have fascist elements, fascist traits, fascist tropes. And there, I think, thinking about fascism is incredibly helpful.
Maybe can I take that from Timothy and ask Stephanie, how useful is the terminology of fascism as a tool to analyze? And would you agree with Timothy that it's almost too complex to define it at all?
Well, if you ask historians to define something, then you will always get the answer. It's too complex, and you have 100 definitions, and so on. And so in this sense, I absolutely agree with Timothy that it's very helpful to look at the historical fascism and to look at the different characteristics of this phenomenon, and then to see what is going on today and to see parallel similarities and dissimilarities. But I think it would broaden in order to broaden our vision and get a little bit away from these interwar years, where fascism was fascism with all its destructive force, which is, I think, the reason why we are always inhibited of using the word today. I think I very much like the vision or the ideas of the late Zev Sternhell, the Israeli historian, one of the eminent historians on the history of fascism. And he, I think 2 or 3 years ago, he was in Berlin, shortly before his death, giving a talk about the return of European fascism. Of course, everybody was okay. That's what he thinks. But then in his explanation or in his perspective, he goes far beyond the interwar years. He says that fascism is kind of the core that came to power in the 1920s and 30s, but it's a part of a movement which is basically from the 19th century, which is the counter-Enlightenment movement, which is directed against all the essential values that were developed during the Enlightenment, like equality, fraternity, of course, rationality, human rights, etc. So, already in the 19th century, he can trace this movement of things that we want to go against it, against equality for minorities, equality for women, etc., etc. So, in his perspective, the movement of what then was called fascism in the interwar years and had certain very specific characteristics, especially when it came to power, the roots are in the 19th century, which also means it didn't stop in 45. In 45, we had military victory. Fascism was defeated in various countries except for Spain. But in Spain, the United States and later the Federal Republic helped the Franco regime in order to transform itself into a clerical military dictatorship, or half-military dictatorship, sort of the fascist roots of Spanish fascism were less important after the Second World War. So he died in his bed. He didn't have to be defeated because the regime changed.
Could I take that up? So first of all, if we look at the 19th century, you would say it's anti-enlightenment is one of the strong features, or against all the ideas of the Enlightenment. Yeah. Now, if we look at the 20th century, you said it also had certain characteristics, evidently in different countries, differently. But could you name some of those characteristics that you would assign to this historic form?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think there's a self-stylization of victimhood, of decline, of defeat, which of course made sense in some countries after 1918, and then the vision of salvation and redemption by of course, national and folkish unity at the one hand, and purity towards the inside. So in order to achieve both unity and purity, what is needed is a very clear-cut image of the enemy inside and also the exterior enemy. So this, I think it was Robert Paxton who called it political energy, served to create a mass movement which then came to power, destroyed democracies and installed a regime which was characterized again by putting this into practice, which was violence against the internal enemy, be it Bolshevism, the Jews, be it the homosexuals in Germany, for example, and then tending towards expansion, as did the Italians, especially in Africa and in their colonial endeavors in Africa and wars, but also against Yugoslavia. So, and then of course the Germany was the Second World War and the Holocaust. So this is like in those historians who have tried to put this into a kind of like this history of fascism in interwar times in a kind of order, in a systematic order, they speak of different phases. That this is a movement, first it's an intellectual idea, then a movement, then a regime, always with the help of the traditional elites. Without the help of the traditional elites, fascism did not come to power anywhere. And then once it is in power, the tendency towards destruction, inward and outward. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important to see that it can also change backward, as in the Spanish case. Once it's not defeated, it doesn't have to stay in this.
Daniel, if I may have one more question we need to coordinate who's allowed to ask the question. So can I have one more to Michel, and then
you may. You
Michel,
may.
How, if we stay for a moment in that historic sort of key phase of different types of fascism, how central was anti-Semitism to that fascism?
Well, it depends if we deal with Italian fascism or with Nazism. And this is why I think we must be very careful when we use the word fascism. At the very beginning, historically, it's Italian. It's fasci. It's not Nazism. Then, could it become a kind of family name for Japan, Germany, Italy at that time? This is not totally sure. That's my first point. So if you want to deal with anti-Semitism, it is clear that Italy was much less anti-Semitic in this movement than Germany. This is absolutely clear. So this is my first point. Now to make another step in your question, in the answer to your question, we must be very careful with anachronism. That is to say, using categories that were made for a certain historical moment, using these categories for other historical moments. And I am not sure that using the word fascism today is really appropriate, even if we use it not as a very historical, precise phenomenon, but as a kind of family name. Yeah. The people that are involved are not exactly the same. The discourse is not exactly the same. The forms of action are not exactly the same. We could find many differences, including the relationship to violence. If I take the French case, I don't want to generalize too much, but for instance, you cannot say that the National Front is in favor of using violence in order to achieve their goals. You cannot say that. Maybe in other cases there is a more positive, if I can say it like that, relationship to violence. But it is not the case. It is not the case, at least in my country. So there are so many differences that we should be more, we should work a little bit more and create new vocabulary. Fascism, the word was obvious. It became absolutely clear. Today we don't have, and this is my last remark, we don't have the real good vocabulary to deal with these phenomena. We say populism. We sometimes say national populism. We say extremism. We say nationalism. We say extremism. But these are not words that are totally satisfying. So we have a problem of language in front of this phenomenon. This would be my my point. So I am a little bit like Timothy. I would start from analyzing what is at stake, really, concretely. What are these phenomena? What are these movements? And I would not try to too quickly say, oh, this is fascism. This would be my position in this debate.
Daniel.
But granted, and I think it's important to begin with these, let's call them definitional anxieties. That said, and I'm going to address a couple of points, and then I want to turn to Masha Gessen, who has written very powerfully on the phenomenon of a kind of resistance to acknowledging the nature of the phenomenon that one is looking at, whatever its name may be. Can we not, granted what everyone has said thus far, can we nonetheless establish I think it was Timothy Garton Ash who used the word tropes that we see recurring, which are in common with historical fascist regimes. Xenophobia, the sort of elevation of myths of national purity, anti-Semitism, nativism, the fantasy of a original population that is now being threatened by outsiders or traitors from within. I would say, and I'm not nearly as much an expert as all of you are, but it seems to me that these are all of them traits that we have been seeing rise to the surface once again. And Masha, here I'm going to turn to you, and I would certainly like to hear a response to what I just said, but Masha has written very powerfully about, among many other things, the way in which when there is an authoritarian figure who can manipulate these tropes, then we're in a familiar territory, even though there may not be exact correspondences historically, or the present phenomenon may have arisen out of a different set of constitutive circumstances. But when those tropes are wielded by a powerful authoritarian figure with a great demagogic appeal, it seems to me that we're in the same boat, even though the boat might have a different name. Masha, what are your thoughts? You're muted, I think.
Well, what will happen first? I will learn to unmute, or the pandemic will end. I mean, like any conversation about language, this becomes a meta conversation because we're, I think the people who have spoken so far have not only advanced, but also illustrated all the arguments for and against using the word fascism, right? I'm lucky in a way to be not an academic, but a journalist. And so I think more proportionally about the utility of using a word than the correctness of using a word, right? Why would I use it here and now as opposed to a different term? And so a reason not to use the word fascism is exactly what Michelle illustrated, which is that it immediately gets you into an argument about the differences between the current situation and historical situations, which will always be the case, right? No period in history is exactly the same as any earlier period. No country, no political movement in one land is exactly the same as a political movement in another land. And I think that's a very strong argument against using a word that has been applied so many times to describe so many different things in so many different periods, because you risk getting into this argument. On the other hand, I think the strongest argument for using the word fascism is, and particularly in journalism, and this is something that I've thought about a lot, even though I've done it very little. And I'll talk in a minute about I think the one time that I decided to do it in a New York article. journalism, even though we often call it the first draft of history, is in a way the opposite of history. Journalism has a very strong normalizing inertia. We see things and we immediately strive to describe them as though they were exactly as things had always been and always will be. Right? We see something that happens for the first time, and in a very sort of a historical way, act as though this is something that is in no way unusual. This is not a normal way of thinking about journalism, right? We think about journalism as being sensationalist, but if you think about the way sort of coverage of politics is structured in exactly that way. It is structured in a way to communicate to the reader that these things are normal and regular for the simple reason that we're witnessing them. And if we're witnessing them, then they're not isolated events of history. They're not things that that we can define and put behind us and sort of say that was a phenomenon that we have described that is different from what we're experiencing now, right? What we're experiencing now is almost by definition in journalism normal. And so a word like fascism, or the word fascism, has the ability to denormalize the conversation, right? It carries a lot of risks, but it draws attention to itself. It immediately begs the question: why is this person using this this term, and is it warranted? And I think sometimes it is. It has utility. I chose to use the word fascism when Donald Trump used military helicopters and other military force to clear a square in Washington, D.C. for a photo opportunity with the Bible. And it was an aesthetic move that was so strongly, that so strongly referenced fascist aesthetics that I thought, okay, this is a moment to point that out. Because any other way of talking about it in journalism would have normalized it. The President of the United States posed for a photo in a public square in Washington, D.C. has a way of sort of communicating that there's nothing to see here. And what I wanted to say was there is something to see here, and this, in fact, is what we're looking at.
Yeah, sorry, I think Timothy Garton asked wants to say something relative to this.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Perhaps I can come in and pick up from where Masha left off and say that I think, Masha, what you just said and what, in a sense, we were saying are entirely compatible in the following way. What we are cautioning against is using fascism as a noun, as a systemic, comprehensive description of the system. And that's not only intellectually problematic, as Michelle and Stephanie said, it's also politically problematic, because then the defenders of very nasty regimes immediately say, but Donald Trump isn't committing genocide, but Viktor Orban doesn't have concentration camps, and so on and so forth. It gives an easy out. But I'm entirely happy and indeed in favor of using the word fascist as an adjective together with a particular noun. Fascist rhetoric, fascist tactics, fascist movement, post-fascist party, all these things exist. So for example, one I care deeply about, which is Hungary. I mean, a friend of mine who's a professor at the Central European University said to me just casually when we were talking about why so many people were leaving Hungary, he said, you know, they don't want to live in a fascist country. And sure, we have to talk about that, but then you have to take it apart. And in the case of Viktor Orban, he has certain fascist traits. So it's the politics of resentment, it's anti-liberalism, it's heavily gendered, male chauvinist, paternalistic, it's the folk, the people against cosmopolitan elites and ethnic others. It has all those features, but what it doesn't have, or only right at the margins, is that really important element, which is political violence, which of course you do have in the US and you do have in Putin's Russia. So it's kind of illuminating if you go at it with the adjective rather than the noun.